Welcome everyone to the end of week 1 of our online course, Jane Austen, Myth, Reality and Global Celebrity. I'm Gillian Dow. You've been seeing me this week throughout the course in the videos, but also in the chat where I've been responding to some of your comments as we've been going along. I always really enjoy seeing how people are responding to the material that we've put together for you. So I'm going to try now and talk about some of the broad themes you've been engaging with this week in the hopes that you'll find it useful and interesting as you move on to week 2 of the course. So one of the first things we got you to do was to look up Charlotte Bronte's response to Jane Austen's writing, and to do that via the Reading Experience database, which I always think is a fascinating resource. One of the really interesting things about these reading experiences, we always have to think about who the experience is being recorded for. And in this case, this wasn't Charlotte Bronte's private secret diary. It wasn't a work she was writing for publication either. It was a letter she was writing to her publisher, someone called W.S. Williams. And I think one of the most interesting things about that is Bronte herself is an establishing writer. You know, she's someone who's trying to forge her own way in the realist novel in decades after Austen was publishing. Of course, they are two very different writers, but I think it would be a little bit too easy to say that Bronte didn't like Austen. I think she's kind of muscling up and saying, well, you know, she's all very well, but, you know, I am just as good, or indeed I'm better. That kind of professional jealousy perhaps coming in there. We then moved on to thinking about education, and that's a fascinating topic in the 18th century. I always think that there's very little that unites women writers in the 18th century, but one of the things that unites them is they all consider in some way the importance of female education, and in education more generally, actually. And it's one of the recognised things that women can perfectly acceptably write in and for. They can write educational works, they can write works for children. That's absolutely respecting the sphere in which they're considered to properly inhabit, I suppose. So education, very broad topic, not at all agreed how education should function, whether it should be for everyone, whether it should be a training. What do we do with class in the period? Are we going to be training people to inhabit their class and to fulfill the duties of their class and to remain in that class? Or is education about betterment? And writers don't agree. You'll have seen two, on the surface, quite different writers, Mary Wollstonecraft on one hand and Hannah More on the other. But actually, when we look at them, they're not so very different in the extracts we've given you. They have similar ideas about what education could and should be doing, and they're not categorical. Jane Austen engages in ideas of education and what education is and should be in her novels all the time. This is something that's implied, but in the narrative voice is explicit in conversations between her main protagonists, and always really interesting to see how she's thinking through those issues in her writing. One of the ways in which we can think about her thoughts on education too is via her thoughts on reading and what her characters are reading, or perhaps what they could and should be reading. And we've got you to think this week about Jane Austen's own reading. What is it we know that she read? What didn't she read? What do we have no evidence of her reading? So, for example, we've got absolutely no evidence she read Mary Wollstonecraft. We do know she read Hannah More. She talks about reading Caleb's in Search of a Wife in her letters, but we don't know that she read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, but I think it very likely that she did at some point. So Austen's own reading, she talks of her family being great novel readers and not afraid of being so. And there's lots of references to novel reading, both positively and negatively in her work. I'm sitting here with my, you can't quite see it there, my Henry Tilney mug with a quotation on the back: "The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid." And Northanger Abbey is a novel that engages with the novel. It's very frequently read as a critique, a satire on the Gothic novel, and of course it is that, but it's also a defense of the novel more generally. There's a wonderful passage in chapter 5 that talks very explicitly about the novel being a wonderful art form, expressive, full of detail, something that readers really can learn from. So those of you who don't know Northanger Abbey, I do encourage you to read it. Of course, one of the resources we also got you to look at this week was the Godmersham Park Library. So the recreation of the library at Godmersham Park that belonged to Jane Austen's brother Edward. Wonderful resource. It's always great fun to click on the spines and to see what was in that collection. Several of you picked up that there were a lot of French works. You're absolutely right. This was completely standard in a gentleman's library in the 18th century. France is the dominant educated culture in the period. It's at the centre, and everything else is going out from France. And there's considerable evidence that the British gentry classes bought volumes to furnish their libraries that were either from France and they came back via grand tours, or indeed in French booksellers in London. There were several, and we know that they sold the kind of sets that the Godmersham Park Library had. Now, I have looked at some of these works, so they're no longer at Godmersham Park, they are now at Chawton House, and it's very clear that a great many of those volumes of memoirs, rather than French novels, there are a few not French novels, but actually the dominant form in the Godmersham Park Library was French memoirs and French works of history. So to give you just one example, the memoirs of Madame de Maintenon are there, all I think 12 volumes of them, and it's quite clear that no one in the Knight family has ever really read them. I mean, this doesn't feel like a volumes that have been poured over by readers through the generations. So, you know, is it perhaps that you furnish your library with suitable reading material, but you never quite get round to reading it, just like Emma with her lists carefully drawn up in Austen's novel Emma. She makes these suitable lists, but she doesn't actually read them. And I imagine you've all got volumes on your shelves that you think, oh, I really must read those one day. This would be improving and worthwhile stuff, and you never quite get round to it. I know I certainly have. A lot of you have been thinking about some myths that we know about Austen too. You know, things that we think we know about Austen and things that we think we know about how she wrote. We'll be dealing with that a lot more next week, but I thought I'd tackle one of them head on, which is this question of publishing anonymously. People often think it wasn't at all respectable for women to publish in the 18th century, and so therefore they all published anonymously, or indeed by using some kind of pseudonym, or as Austen did, using by a lady. But of course, as I said in the comments, several ladies seem to have been men. We don't know whether Austen chose to publish as a lady or whether that was a suggestion from her publisher. There are lots of things we don't know about this. What we do know is that several of Austen's contemporaries published quite openly under their own names, and several men in the period did not. So anonymity in the 18th century is standard rather than exceptional. Things change in the 19th century. And again, if we think about Charlotte Bronte and indeed her sisters, Emily and Anne, and we think about how they first published, they adopted the pseudonyms Currer, Ellis and Acton. So it becomes less respectable in the 19th century for a woman to publish using her own name. George Eliot, of course, is another famous example there. There are a couple of comments and questions that I thought I'd pick up on and deal with right now. There was a question about books being published split across multiple volumes, and was this just a printing, binding, logistical decision with all volumes being available to purchase at the same time as a set, or was it more common for volumes to be released over time? That's a good question. It's not one that has an easy answer, I'm afraid. This participant pointed out that Sir Charles Grandison was 6 or 7 volumes released over several months. In fact, that wasn't typical. Austen's publications came out as three volume sets of each novel all at once. So Pride and Prejudice, 3 volumes, but all published at once. The exception there, perhaps, is Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, which was published as 4 volumes, 2 for Northanger Abbey, 2 for Persuasion, but again, all at the same time. The question of a work being serialized, again, that's something that happens much more in the 19th century. Charles Dickens famously publishes his novels in serial form. Another point that I just want to end with, I think, is one raised about Mr. Collins reading books like Fordyce's sermons to young ladies because he thinks it's his duty to try and improve their minds. That's a brilliant passage, isn't it? Where he's given a work, but he can identify that it's from a circulating library and therefore probably a novel, and he gets very concerned about that and rejects some other things and then selects Fordyce's sermons. He's only a couple of pages in when Lydia gapes and starts gossiping about the regiment. And then he puts the book aside. Now, despite the protestations from Mrs. Bennet and Jane and Lizzie, he does not pick it up again. He goes instead to play backgammon with Mr. Bennet, despite their protestations. That's Austen's narrative voice, isn't it? Very cleverly telling us that actually nobody wanted to read Fordyce's sermons, not even Mr. Collins. I do recommend it to you, though. Fordyce's sermons is an instructive read, and when one thinks about the popularity of the text in the 18th century, many editions, I think 18 editions of Fordyce's sermons. So having a read of some of them, particularly perhaps the sermon on novel reading, would be instructive and add to your enjoyment of the course, I'm sure. Okay, that's all I have for today, but I hope you're enjoying the course. We're looking forward to seeing you again next week as we tackle some other issues in relation to Austen's life and times, looking at her brother's biography of her, the Navy, gardens in the period. You'll be meeting more of my colleagues at the University of Southampton, and I will see you next week.